So I came across this thing a few weeks ago, and honestly, I wasn't even looking for it. I was just going down a rabbit hole about water storage, droughts, and off-grid systems, and this kept showing up over and over again. So eventually, I figured, all right, let me actually look into what this thing is. It's called Joseph's Well. And before you immediately assume this is some weird internet scam or survival fantasy thing, I had the exact same reaction at first. But once I actually understood the core idea behind it, it started making a lot more sense than I expected. Because the problem it's trying to address is very real. Water access in parts of the US has been getting increasingly unstable over the last few years. Reservoir levels dropping, wells running dry, restrictions becoming more common in drought areas, and even people with private wells are realizing those systems aren't always as permanent as they thought. And honestly, water is one of those things people assume will always be there until suddenly it isn't. The creator behind this, a guy who goes by John Gilmore, although there's a disclaimer saying that's a pen name, talks about his own well drying up in Arizona and the delays involved in drilling a new one. He also mentions people stealing stored water during shortages, which sounds extreme. But when resources get limited, people start acting differently. Anyway, that's basically the situation that led him into building the system. So what actually is Joseph's Well? At its core, it's a DIY guide for building a simplified atmospheric water generator, which sounds complicated, but the idea itself is actually pretty straightforward. The system pulls moisture from the air through condensation, filters that water, and stores it for drinking and basic use. And honestly, when you break it down, it's basically controlled condensation. The same thing that happens on a cold glass during a humid day, just engineered into a repeatable system. Commercial versions of this technology already exist. Some are used industrially, some commercially, and there are even military-grade variations of atmospheric water generation systems. The problem is the price. A lot of those units cost thousands of dollars. What this guide tries to do instead is simplify the concept into something a regular person could realistically build using hardware store components and a smaller budget. From what I saw, the estimated materials cost land somewhere around $150 depending on sourcing. That's the main pitch. Now, the actual setup itself seems pretty practical. You're essentially cooling incoming air enough for moisture to condense, collecting that water, filtering it, and storing it. There's also an off-grid version that uses a small solar setup with a battery system. So theoretically, even during a power outage, the unit could still continue generating drinking water as long as there's humidity in the air. That part alone is probably what makes this interesting to a lot of preparedness-minded people. Not because it replaces an entire household water infrastructure, but because it creates another layer of independence. Now, obviously, output matters, and this is probably the biggest thing people should understand before getting unrealistic expectations. Atmospheric water generators absolutely do work, that part is real technology, but water production depends heavily on humidity levels. A humid environment is naturally going to produce better results than an extremely dry climate. So somebody in Florida might get a very different experience compared to someone in the Arizona desert. That's just physics. The creator does mention that the system is mainly intended for drinking, cooking, and basic daily water needs, not running an entire modern household exactly the same way a municipal system would. So this feels less like infinite free water forever and more like a practical backup system that could reduce dependency on traditional infrastructure. And honestly, that positioning makes a lot more sense to me. In terms of daily use, the process itself seems relatively straightforward. You place the system somewhere ventilated, connect power, either directly or through the off-grid setup, and let it run. According to the guide, water starts collecting fairly quickly after startup. Then you transfer and store what's generated. There are also additional guides, included covering water storage, purification, remineralization, and even explanations about contaminants commonly found in tap water. So it's positioned more like a complete preparedness package rather than just a single blueprint PDF. You also get video walkthroughs, build instructions, materials lists, sourcing suggestions, both grid and off-grid versions, and email support from the creator, which honestly adds a bit more legitimacy to it than I expected initially. The price is currently $67 as a one-time purchase, and it's sold through ClickBank with a 60-day refund policy. And to be fair, ClickBank refunds are usually pretty straightforward if someone buys a digital product and decides it's not for them. Now, there is one thing I think people should know going into this. The sales page itself leans very heavily into apocalyptic and biblical framing. There's a lot of end times language, collapse scenarios, famine references, that kind of thing. Some people will connect with that immediately, other people are probably going to find it excessive. Personally, I think it helps to separate the presentation style from the actual underlying concept. Because regardless of the marketing angle, the core idea here is still a DIY atmospheric water generator system. And that concept itself is grounded in real technology. What will probably determine someone's experience more than anything is their climate, their expectations, and how comfortable they are building things themselves. Because this definitely doesn't feel like a plug-and-play appliance. It feels more like a project, a system you manage, something you experiment with and optimize over time. And honestly, that's probably exactly why some people would enjoy it, especially people already into homesteading, preparedness, off-grid living, backup systems, or self-reliance in general. For somebody like that, this probably feels less like buying a product and more like learning a capability. If someone expects instant unlimited water with zero effort, this probably isn't going to match reality. But if the idea of generating usable water from humidity using a DIY setup sounds interesting in itself, then I can absolutely understand why this caught people's attention. I can't personally say how smoothly every build turns out because obviously results will vary from person to person. But as an overall concept, honestly, it's one of the more interesting DIY water systems I've looked into recently. Anyway, that's basically what I found after digging through everything. If you want to see what's actually included in the guide and make your own decision on it, I left the official page in the description below.